Well, thank you for tuning in and watching this video. I really appreciate it. Whether you're watching as a teacher, may the Lord bless you and give you insight on that as you teach your class, or whether you're watching this to keep up with the church and keep up with your Sunday school class, I really appreciate you doing that as well. And I'm glad we can do this so that when you're on vacation or when you're sick or something like that, that you can watch this if you had to miss Sunday school. And this is the lesson that we're going to present on the 30th of June of 2024. And we've got the title listed as Clear Communication, Generosity, and Peace. Clear communication, generosity, and peace. And I think what we could say there with just the title is clear communication is essential to peace, and I think generosity of spirit is as well. Because when you don't communicate clearly and everything is just kind of vague and general, that just causes more problems. People need to have an understanding of what you are agreeing to or where you are on things. But also, too, when you approach somebody when there's some kind of a conflict or something that needs to be worked out, but you come with a closed-off, stingy spirit, I'm not giving an inch to them, or if they think this is going to happen, they've got another thing coming. You never work out any deals like that. You've got to be generous and willing to yield your rights, and that's what ends up with things being more peaceful. Now, we're going to see that in here. I don't know that everything went exactly the way Abimelech wanted it to go, but it was good enough for him. He was willing to yield, and so everything worked out. Now, here's our introduction. Abraham and Abimelech wanted the same thing. However, there was an issue concerning a precious commodity, namely a well. And therefore, they could... And before they could get to their common goal, this thing had to be resolved. It's like this barrier. It's like the elephant in the room. They want to have a peace treaty, but I don't know who brought it up, but there was the thinking here that before we can ever have peace and before we can ever get along and before we can deal honestly with each other, we got to figure out this thing about this well. There's something that is wrong here and something that is going to have to be worked out, resolved in all of this situation. Now, both men had a different assumption about the well situation. I mean, isn't that the way it is? You talk to somebody with a marital problem and you talk to the husband and you go, oh, okay, now I understand it. And then you talk to the wife and then you realize, uh-oh, I didn't understand a thing. They have two different perspectives on the same situation. That happens a lot of times in business. That happens a lot of times about pay for a service or for goods or something like that. I thought you said that would be $35. I had a man one time that put in a new furnace for me, and I talked to Tom Gore about it, and Tom Gore said, if I were you, I would go with that guy. That's a great price on all of that. Well, then when I called the guy back to have him install it, and I said, and this is what you agreed to, the guy kind of balked a little bit. I don't think I agreed to that, and we talked about it, and we were able to work it out. I mean, sometimes things can get tense or contentious over something like that. It's the world in which we live. People have problems. People have all kinds of... And then you throw in social media, and some people get to where they are really brave and strong and tough behind a keyboard, and not so much when you meet them face to face. And so things get said that are misunderstood, and other people get involved, and it just gets to be a mess. So these two had an assumption about the well. Abraham is saying, that's my well. Abimelech is saying, what do you mean? It's a well. We can all use the well, can't we? And we'll find out more about that as we get into our text. And so until they talked frankly, nothing would be resolved. And even then, Abraham acted in a generous way that diffused the whole situation, and he showed sincerity that was a problem before for Abimelech, that brought them past the barrier and to the common good. After all, I don't think Abraham was saying, no, I want you and your flocks to die, right? And I don't think Abimelech is saying, I want you and your flocks out of here and I want them to die. I don't think either man has that. They understand that both of them need water. Both of them have flocks that need the water. And so Abraham was loving God and loving his neighbor by resolving the issue. And if we could think about that, we know the great commandment is to love God with everything that we have and possess, wholeheartedly, in other words. But right after that, Jesus said, and the other is to love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, the two of them go together. And we don't always understand that when we work out problems with other people, and when we come to, most problems have to have some degree of compromise. We've kind of made that a bad word in the church. I'm not going to compromise. Well, don't compromise the gospel or anything like that. But there's a host of other things that you can compromise on, and you can yield, and you can give, and you can be generous, and things can be worked out. And we don't understand that getting along with our neighbor and resolving things is part of the way that we love God with everything that we have. And that's what Abraham is doing. In fact, in this story, we kind of think about when it comes to Abraham and Abimelech, finally, Abraham does something well. And play on words, does something right there. Okay, so let's look at verse 25. Then Abraham rebuked Abimelech. Whoa, here we go. First, it was Abimelech, kind of in a backhanded way, rebuking Abraham. Now, be sure you tell me the truth. You owe me on all of that. And yet, when we get to this point, it's Abraham who rebukes Abimelech. Why? Because of a well of water, very precious commodity, which Abimelech's servants had seized. Well, that doesn't sound friendly, does it? Verse 26, and Abimelech said, just like he said with Sarah, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. Same thing that he said about Sarah. I didn't know that she was another man's wife, right? And I don't know what that says about Abimelech. You can come up with your own conclusions, whether he was just out of touch or whether these are just two situations, coincidences, I guess we would say, where he genuinely didn't know. I don't know. But verse 27 says, so Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech. And the two of them made a covenant. They cut a covenant is what it says in the Hebrew. And verse 28 says, and Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Then Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs in which you have set by themselves? And he, Abraham, said, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be my witness that I have dug this well. And therefore he called the place, we say Beersheba, in Hebrew it is Be'er Seba, because the two of them swore an oath there. And thus they made a covenant at Beersheba, and Abimelech, turned too soon, arose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. And then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines, in Abimelech's land, many days. Okay? Now that sounds like a good resolution when you put everything together. So let's talk about what was happening here and what the situation was. Number one, there was a situation, that's obvious, isn't it? But look at the next part of the point, to be resolved. Verses 25. And I want you to think about, if you serve a sovereign God, a God who is all-knowing, a God who is all-powerful, and a God who is ever-present, We think about what it says in the book of Jeremiah, where the Lord says, "Is anything too hard for me?" And I think we approach life, and we especially approach our problems, with the idea that, well, this is probably going to blow up in my face. I don't see any good coming out of this, and just terribly negative, instead of thinking, this could be the beginning of something wonderful. I think about the movie Casablanca. I love that movie. And at the very end of it, where Humphrey Bogart says to the cop, he says, "This could be the beginning of a beautiful friendship." How about if we looked at our problems to say, hey, here's an opportunity to resolve things. Here's an opportunity to become friends. Here's an opportunity to come to a mutual understanding because of the power and because of the grace and the mercy of God. I mean, after all, God already knows all about it, and He's the creator of both of you, so He knows what makes you tick and what makes the other person tick. And if we could just do it in the spirit of Christ-likeness, maybe we would see more things resolved. But at the same time, notice that there was frankness here. In verse 25, then Abraham rebuked Abimelech. Now, Abimelech had already kind of rebuked Abraham. Now Abraham is returning the favor, but it was done in love, and there was legitimacy to it. It was completely honest, and it was because of a well which Abimelech's servants had seized. So, okay, what's the situation? Abraham had dug a well. I'm sure his servants did it, but nonetheless, it belonged to him. And Abimelech's servants had taken the well, and they are all trying to survive. And so any food, any plants, any of their flocks, any livestock, and even fuel for the fire. I mean, without water, there are no trees anywhere, not even in the oasis. And so for their fires that they had to use to cook and all of that had been taken from them. Because the word seize there, the Hebrew word, means to rob, to steal, and to take violently. In other words, there was an altercation over that, and Abimelech's people won. May have been more of them. They may have been better armed. Who knows? But apparently Abimelech didn't know anything about it. And so Abraham is making a legal protest before Abimelech. Okay, if we're going to live peaceably in the land, we got a problem. Your servants came and they stole a well that I dug. And Abimelech would have understood that completely. Water is so precious there. And then he said, well, I didn't know anything about it. In other words, I didn't command it. Kind of plausible deniability, we say. And so that brings us to point number 2. Abimelech pleads innocence in the whole thing. And he said, I do not know who has done this thing. In other words, I didn't command this. This isn't a part of my plan. This isn't a part of our war strategy or anything like that. And then he goes and kind of rebukes Abraham again, and you did not tell me. That's kind of like when you talk to somebody after there's a problem and they say, why am I just now hearing about this? Have you ever felt that way yourself? Why didn't you tell me first? Why didn't you tell me when I could do something about it? I've had times when I've said that to people. And that's kind of what Abimelech is saying to Abraham. You mean this has been going on and you didn't tell me? You could have sent a messenger. You could have sent one of your servants to me. And he gives the impression here that I would have done something about it. I would have called off the dogs. And he said, nor had I heard of it until today. This is the first I know of it. So the second time, which he pleads ignorance. And if you'll look back at Genesis 20, 44 through 46, but Abimelech had not come near her. This is when he had Sarah. And he said, Lord, will you slay a righteous man also? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And she, even she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity, that's a strong word, the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands have I done this. And that must have been true because it says, and God said to him in a dream, yes, I know. So Abraham believed Abimelech, and a reward was made in this situation. So number 3, let's look at Abraham's generosity. because we find him that he's the one that provides the animals for the covenant. Now, you remember way back when we were looking at his life and God made a covenant with Abraham? And you remember the word in Hebrew for covenant is berit, and it means to cut. And what they would do is they would divide the animals in half. Kind of gruesome, isn't it? And they would set them with a space between them, and the two parties would walk between the dead, slain animals. And it's as if they were saying, may this happen to me if I don't uphold my terms of the covenant. Remember that? Well, that's what's happening here. And Abraham provides the animals for the covenant. That's significant because the animals were valuable, and that was a part of his herd. That was a part of his livestock. They may have been used for breeding. They may have been used for food. We don't really know. But Abraham provides them. And that must have been something that spoke to Abimelech. This guy is serious. And he means business with all of this because he's willing to put out the animals that are going to be slaughtered for the sake of the covenant. So we find the generosity of Abraham coming to play here. I remember when I was a kid, our pastor in Owasso, he was preaching, and he came across a text that said that the children of darkness are wiser than the children of light. And his explanation of that was sometimes lost people are much more generous than God's people are. God's people kind of have the idea that I gave my 10% to the church and that's all the Lord or anybody else is ever going to get. And he said that from his days before he was saved, and he spent a lot of times in bars and a lot of times with that kind of a crowd. And he said one thing you knew, if you were sitting in a bar and there were a group of prostitutes and you overheard one of them say that so-and-so has been arrested and put in jail, he said the other prostitutes would start taking up money so they could go bail her out. He said, what would church people do? Just rot. That's rot in there is for all I care, and that kind of thing. He said, but the lost people were always generous to their own. He said he couldn't tell you how many times before he was saved that he would be sitting at a bar and somebody would say, hey buddy, you want a drink? And then they would bring somebody up and said, there's no reason to drink alone. Bartender, get something for him too. And he talked about how they would win friends and loyalty with other people. And Christian people don't tend to do that because we think it's fake or insincere or I shouldn't have to do that or anything. And yet we find an example here that a lot can be done and a lot of things can be solved if we would use a little bit of generosity. And so while Abraham on one hand is kind of sticking up for his legal rights to the well because he dug it and Abimelech's servants came and violently seized the well, at the same time he's not pushing for his rights to say, okay, we'll make a covenant, but you've got to put up your share of the animals too. I'm not doing all this myself. And I think Abraham had learned from the covenant God made with him. You remember Abraham fell into a deep sleep and the Lord walked through those dead animals as if he was saying, the covenant is on me, Abraham. I'm going to make sure it's taken care of. And maybe Abraham is kind of doing the same thing. I'll do this with Abimelech and I'll make sure that I provide all of the animals. And apparently it made a big impact on Abimelech's life. This man's serious. And this man's a good guy. This man is nice. This man is someone that I can trust this time, that he is really changed. And so we find that as we look at the situation of Abraham providing the covenant animals here, it says in verse 27, so Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech for the covenant, and the two of them made a covenant, the cut and the walking between. But look at this in verse 28. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. And then Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs? I thought we did a covenant already. What's going on here? Hadn't everything been done, which you have set by themselves? And Abraham said in verse 30, You will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be a witness that I have dug this well. And therefore he called the place Be'er Seba, Beersheba, because the 2 of them swore an oath there. Isn't that interesting? The covenant's already been made. There's nothing else that needs to be done. It is a true, legal, binding covenant for Abraham and Abimelech. And then Abraham goes over and above, and he goes, and by the way, see these lambs that are over here? I've got them set aside for you, and I want you to take them, because this is your agreement that I am the one who owns the well. In fact, Abraham was in essence paying for a well he had already dug, wasn't he? Now, why would he do that? Did he have to? No, not on your life. Everything else had been taken care of. Abimelech and his general, take off, go home. Pedal your bike on down the street. But Abraham wants to make sure everything is covered, and Abraham wants to bless Abimelech, and so he takes those 7 lambs, a significant blessing and offering to him. And you've noticed here that Abimelech is kind of taken back by it. What in the world are you doing, and what does this mean? What is the purpose of all of this? Am I understanding this? Maybe Abimelech didn't want to be in Abraham's debt. He didn't want to take something with the understanding, oh yeah, I gave that to you, only to have Abraham come back 6 months later and say, where are those lambs I loaned you, or something like that. He's wanted, again, to make it clear and to make it upfront and understood. And Abraham says it's a gift. And it's a gift that says, this is my witness, and by you receiving this, that well really is mine. And that is a well that I really dug. It's not something that I just came up on and found and stole and took for myself. This is something I labored for. This is something that I own. And so they swore an oath there. And so that place where the well is, they named it Beersheba, or Be'er Seba. And the Seba on that can be translated 7, or it can also be translated oath. They're very similar words. And so the well of the 7s, the 7 lambs, or the well of the oath, the place where they settled the whole situation. So, all of this shows Abraham's seriousness, and if Abimelech had any doubt, it would settle now. Let's go to the 4th point, and the agreement brought peace, and that's the good news. And thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. And then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, I'm certain by the well there, so that it could grow from the water in the well. And there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. First time that term is used. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. So what happened? Mission accomplished. And these 2 men came together as somewhat adversarial, but they didn't leave that way. They left as friends. They left with an agreement. They left with an understanding of the situation. Isn't that great? Don't you wish we could resolve more things among the people of God like that? But you can't fly off the handle, and you've got to be generous, and you've also got to be frank and honest too. So Beersheba, the well of 7s, or the well of an oath, is something that is very significant in the life of Abraham. Now it mentions Philistines. They weren't called that yet. They weren't yet a people group. That comes later. But remember, Moses is writing this hundreds of years later when there were Philistines. And so he uses that modern day tag that the people would all go, oh yeah, that's right over there. The Philistines, okay? And they later would become the enemies of Israel. The greatest enemy, Goliath, by the way, was a Philistine. And so Abimelech returns to his normal life, and yet Abraham turns to God. That tells you a little bit about the 2 men. Abimelech, after all of this and the significance of it, he goes back to normal. And as I think about that, how many times do we have a revival meeting or a church camp and we get all worked up and, oh yeah, I'll do anything, and then we go back to normal life? That's something to really pray about. We come to church and we kind of get stirred, but we're not changed enough we go back to normal life. And that's what happened here. But Abraham continued to worship the Lord, and he calls on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And then, just so he never forgets, and just so there's always a memorial, every time he or his servants come to get water for themselves or for their herds, what do they see? A tree. And those trees don't grow naturally in the desert like that. It's obvious that tree was planted. It's kind of like that old saying, if you're out in West Texas or even western Oklahoma, and you see a turtle on a fence post, what do you know? One thing for sure, somebody put him there. And I think the idea is whenever you come up to this well and you're drawing the water out of it, there's a tree planted there as a memorial to say, this was not a well that was here naturally. This is not a well that appeared by accident. This is not a well that is just random. Somebody dug this well, and God was good enough to give the water because that's what was necessary to survive. And with the lambs and with the tree and all of that, it was very, very clear to anybody, this is Abraham's well. Abraham's not using this well because he is some kind of a traitor or some kind of a thief or anything like that. But this is someone who is a man of God, a worshiper of God. And so through prayer and worship and planting a tree as a memorial reminds me of the Lord's Supper, by the way, a memorial that we have. And later a city named Beersheba would mark the southern border of Israel. You'll read in the Old Testament, from Dan to Beersheba. Dan is at the top, Beersheba is at the bottom of the nation of Israel, okay? Means from coast to coast. And both men honored the treaty, and so Abraham was able to live there for many days, time of peace. So let's conclude by thinking about these things. Number one, we should be unafraid to honestly and lovingly rebuke injustice. And number two, we should be careful to listen. It might change our understanding of the other person. And so between these two men, they listened. Abimelech goes, I didn't know that. And there are a lot of things that we don't know, and they change our perspective. Thirdly, we should demonstrate love and forgiveness with our generosity. We don't hold grudges and we don't hold back on everything. We actually bless the other person. And fourthly, in our conclusion, we should not judge someone by their worst moment. And you know, we tend to do that. We look at people and we see someone not at their best, not at the pattern of their life, because most of the time Abraham was a good guy. But we tend to judge them by their worst moment. And that's when Abraham and Sarah lied to Abimelech, and Abimelech hadn't forgotten it, right? Well, we need to be careful as the people of God, not to just take somebody and judge them by the worst of their life, because that's not always fair. That may have been an unguarded moment or something like that. And so again, we think about Romans 12, and we think about verse 18. If it is possible, as far as depends on you, and we talked about that last week, we like to take that part out. Live in peace with everyone. And so may the Lord help you and use this lesson to help you, maybe to think about a strategy to work out a peace treaty, so to speak, with somebody that you really care about but you've been estranged with. And may it help you to understand you don't approach in anger, you don't approach in a warlike manner, you don't approach in a way of, I'm going to get what's mine and all of that kind of thing. Things can be talked out, things can be reasoned out. And both of these men wanted peace. That's very, very clear. They just had some details to work out, but they never lost sight of the goal to make the peace treaty the covenant that they needed between them. And so often people who are fighting, they kind of have the same goal and the same overarching idea about what something ought to be, but it's the little stuff that kind of gets in the way, making mountains out of molehills, and that's where we get tripped up, okay? So thank you again for your time. I appreciate it, and may the Lord bless you, and we will certainly see you as we enter into some more lessons in the upcoming month. Thank you.